those of you who were here last year are familiar with my time in Vietnam flying the Caribou, which was 2 radial engines, 14-cylinder R2000s. The airplane would do 120 knots. So this was a step up in some respects. It was a step backwards in some other respects, but we'll go into that. This picks up where my tour in Vietnam left off. I came back from Vietnam in early 1969 and went to tanker school at Castle Air Force Base in California, which was the first base used by the KC-135 when it was first developed. A little bit of history before we start into the actual airplane and the operations. The Air Force, after World War II, after the Korean War, had decided to institute this strategic bomber concept. And the jet bombers started with basically the B-47 and moved on into the B-52 with lots of little experimental things in between. But the B-52 became the primary nuclear deterrent aircraft in the post-war period, post 50s, 60s, and 70s on up. Well, it's still flying today. They started out with modifications of the Boeing B-29, which was used to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Then the further development of the B-29 was the B-50. That became the KB-50. They had a flying boom on that. Now, I'll go into the why the flying boom in a minute, but of course, the next development was the Boeing C-97, which became the KC-97, which was the old Boeing Stratocruiser that BOAC flew for a while. Very popular airplane, but it could not keep up with the jet bombers that were coming into the fleet. So they needed a jet tanker. They needed something that they could use that would fill the bill for the faster aircraft, and that was the KC-135. Now, the KC-135 was quite a mature airplane when I came onto it in early 68, 69. It was a good airplane, as I say. They're still flying. They still have almost half of the ones that they ever built, and we'll go through the whole history of it in just a moment. So to start out with, the 135 and the Boeing 707 came from the same parentage. This was the Dash 80. This was the very first aircraft that Boeing made. Now, I'm going to show you a film in a few minutes, and I apologize for 2 things. One, the video and sound quality aren't that wonderful because it's an old Super 8 type of film. And the sound system is this little thing here because we couldn't get that to run through these big speakers. But that being said, if you will be able to see what's going on, and I hope you can hear it clear enough. The other thing I'm going to apologize for is when they tell you that the 707 was the first jet transport. We know that it wasn't. All right? I'm aware of the fact that the Comet flew in 1949, and I'm aware of the fact that the first one of these 707s flew in 52. So we were not first off the blocks, even though you're going to hear that in the little Boeing blurb that you hear in a few minutes. So the Dash 80 was the very first prototype. It never went into production, but it was actually the founding aircraft for both the 707 and the KC-135. And this is the film that I'll have you watch just to start out with and before we continue.
Tex Johnston was well aware of just how lively the Dash 80 was. He saw a need to share this knowledge with the public. Louis Boeing had the first jet airplane, which was going to reduce the size of the world by a factor of 2 when measured by flight time. Never before in the history of aviation has there been such a gigantic step. I was convinced that the people should really understand what get their attention, in other words. The annual unlimited hydroplane races during Seattle Seafair Week
always attracted huge crowds. In 1955, the International Air Transport Association and the Society of Aeronautical Engineers planned to hold their annual meetings in Seattle, coinciding with Seafair Week. Boeing Chairman Bill Allen asked techs to make a test flight on Gold Cup Day with a pass over the Gold Cup course. Techs realized he had a unique opportunity. Aviation people from all over the world would be watching. Telling no one, he planned his own special demonstration of the Dash 80's capability.
Techs had no announced plan, nor was there any consideration of making a barrel roll over the speedboat course on Lake Washington that day at all. In fact, he didn't have a man crew. After a 180-degree turn, came back down over the water, pulled up, established the climb, put in the fuel line, did a nice 1G roll, and came out in level flight. And I knew that no one would believe what they had changed, so I turned around and came back and repeated the same thing on the restaurant of heading. I happened to be out at the course. I was not on one of the boats, but I came out on the course and I saw him make the barrel rolls, and I was dumbfounded. And I was as close to the program as anyone was. So he changed sort of forever the image, let's say, of the Boeing company and of the Dash 80 with that one maneuver.
The test flying program for the 707 lasted 4 years. Tex Johnson had his own way of thrilling airline executives with demonstration flights.
IATA, the International Air Transport Association, which includes all the airlines of the world, had assembled in Seattle for their annual convention. And Boeing just happened to have a prototype airplane that was going to shrink the world by a factor of 2. Show fighters and commercial airplanes, and you demonstrate them to impress people what they're capable of. And I knew that the prototype, and there's one maneuver that you can do with no hazard whatsoever. I decided that I would do a roll to impress the people. So I came across and did a Chandelle. My test engineers had to have his camera with him, and he snapped the picture, which is famous today, with the airplane on its back, engines up on top of the running, and they Lake Washington below. I was called to Mr. Allen's office Monday morning, and Mr. Allen asked me if I was there, and I said I was selling an airplane. And explained it's a 1G maneuver, and it's absolutely non-hazardous, but it's very impressive. And his comment was, you know that now, we know that, but just don't do it anymore.
So, basically, there you have it. Now, the KC-135, as I said, comes from the Dash 80, as did the 707. There are a few differences. For one thing, the KC-135, being a military procurement, did not have all of the safety systems and other things that you would see in a civilian airliner. We only had anti-skid on the captain's brakes, the left seat pilot's brakes. We didn't have a lot of the redundancies in the aircraft. And we didn't have thrust reversers, things of that nature, which you would find on civilian aircraft, because our job was to go out and basically eat, drink, and be married, for tomorrow we die. We were supporting the EWO, the Emergency War Order operations, the Nuclear Alert Force, and it was unlikely that we were ever going to come home from a nuclear strike anyway. So we didn't have all of the fancy gadgets on board that most of the civilian airliners did. Now, that being said, when I got the opportunity to join SAC, Strategic Air Command, so if you remember the old Jimmy Stewart movie, I was stationed at Westover Air Force Base in Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Springfield, Massachusetts, just north of Hartford, Connecticut. So right in the heart of New England. I was attached to the 99th Air Refueling Squadron, and we had also the 99th Bomb Wing with a couple of squadrons of B-52D models we'll go into in a bit. The support that we did consisted, when we were at Westover, we were 7 days on quick reaction alert, living in the alert shack where the klaxon could go off. We had to be airborne within 5 minutes. It was, the aircraft were cocked and ready out on the quick reaction pads. The aircraft were equipped with cartridge starters, so the first guy on the airplane just banged on all 4 starters, and we just climbed in and got going. We were supposed to be off the ground, preferably before the bombers, but it just always worked out that you were in amongst everybody because we had all airplanes facing the same way. So we did 7 days on alert, then we had 3 days off, then we did 4 days of flying, training missions and such, navigation, refueling missions and stuff of that nature, all training stuff, and then back on alert again. So it was a pretty boring life, but the tankers were being used extensively in Southeast Asia for the support of the Vietnam War. We had 2 operations that were going on over there. One was called Young Tiger, which was a 90-day deployment in support of fighter operations, which we'll go into in a minute. And the other was Arclight, which was a 6-month deployment based in Guam and supporting B-52 operations, refueling the bombers that were flying from Guam over to Vietnam, because that was a 12-hour mission and they couldn't make it without refueling, so we were there to do that. So I came back from my year in Vietnam and ended up spending the next 9 months out of every year back in Southeast Asia, either on a Young Tiger or an Arclight deployment. Usually they were sort of back to back, so I was hardly ever home anyway. So that was the basic where we were. This is the patch of the 99th Bomb Wing, and then the patch that we had for our own tanker squadron. Before the Vietnam War, and in the early days of the Vietnam War, this is kind of what the tankers were painted up like. We had an orange nose on it, which was for Arctic use. We spent a lot of time refueling KC-135s, the electronic countermeasures versions, and the reconnaissance ones that would go up and fly up and down the Russian border. And so because of that, we always had, we had a red tail and an orange nose, so that if you were forced down in the Arctic, you might be able to see the airplane against the snow. Ramrod was the nose art on these aircraft. This was one of our airplanes, the 99th Bomb Wing, and that was our squadron nose art that was on it. Now, for those of you who are technically oriented, you'll notice that the airplane is, aft of the orange, is bare aluminum. This was later superseded by a matte gray corrosion proofing that they put on it, because once we started operating in the Southeast Asia, the humidity and the proximity to salt in the air for the oceans and such, Pacific Ocean, led them to coat the airplanes with a corrosion proofing. So the airplane was basically called, the Boeing called it the 367-60, but it was entered service in 1957. The engines at this time were J57s, a very first generation, a turbojet engine, not a turbo fan, just a straight, what we used to call a straight pipe turbojet with water injection. And it was a very interesting airplane to fly. You had to have a certain fatalism in order to fly this airplane. I'll tell you why in a minute. Over the course of time, they built about 820 total airframes, of which 780-ish became tankers. The others were used as transports or reconnaissance versions, special air missions type of things with electronics and all. You've seen photographs, I'm sure, of them with these big bulges that stick out and stuff. So they had a lot of different uses for the airframe, but I'm going to talk about the tanker version. So what's it made of? Basically, as I said, this is a version with the corrosion proofing on it. This is kind of what it looked like when I was flying it. That's not a quality check on the vertical stabilizer. That's a walkway, because the vertical stabilizer folds down for maintenance. If they needed to do some work on it, they would fold it down, and that check mark thing is just where you can walk on it. That's just a walkway. As I said, 4 J57 turbojet engines. This is kind of the specs. Now it talks about the engine thrust being 13,750 with water. It was 10,000 without. So if you do the math, you can see that water injection gave you the equivalent of another engine. So at takeoff, you had the thrust equivalent, actually a little bit more, of 5 engines rather than 4. The downside of that was that if you lost water, you were really out of luck. Now, when I talk about the difference between military thinking and civilian thinking, in civilian life, we have something called accelerate stop distance and a speed called V1. If you lose an engine before V1, you still have enough runway to stop safely before you get to the end, and after V1, you have enough power, even with an engine failure, to get airborne. Now that's for civilian life. Now for the KC-135, in its support of the nuclear option, the Air Force philosophy was you got 11,000 feet of runway, so you get off the ground on the 11,000th foot of that runway. And no matter where you stopped or where you lost an engine, you were not going to get airborne. So, as I said, you had to be a bit fatalistic about this, because even though we had parachutes and stuff, we think, well, that's it. If we're on our EWO mission, our nuclear support mission, and we lost water, we probably wouldn't get airborne. And that is really quite an interesting thing. We were doing a mission, I was doing a mission once out of Fairbanks, Alaska, and it was just that we were going off to refuel an RC-135 that was going to go up and down and taunt the Russians on the Russian border over the North Pole. And I took off, and we had 2 minutes of water in the system. Now, in their brilliance, they wired the water system up so that you had left water and right water. So if you lost water on one side, you lost the equivalent of an engine. If you lost all the water, it was symmetrical, but then you didn't have very much thrust. So I lost water just coming off the ground. We lost everything. The whole water injection system quit. And I was still at 1,000 feet trying to get my flaps up over Fairbanks, which is 40 miles north, and annoying the people in Fairbanks with this tanker going overhead. But we really relied on the water injection to get us airborne. And once it was gone, it was gone. As I said, you flipped it up when you started your takeoff roll and hoped like hell that you actually got the whole 2 minutes out of it. So the numbers basically 109,000 pounds empty weight with a max gross weight approaching 300,000. So we could carry a substantial amount of stuff, mostly fuel, but sometimes we'd carry some cargo. And it had a basic performance that would be the equivalent of any airliner of that era, 707, DC-8, Comet 2s and 3s. It says ceiling 40,000 feet, but we never got anywhere close to that because the airplane just didn't have the poop to get up there. Now, the theory behind water injection is that by injecting water into the engines, you are increasing the mass airflow through the airplane, the engine, therefore you're getting extra thrust. So you are injecting it right into the combustion chambers. It increases the mass, but it also cools the turbines down, which means that you can run the engines hotter than you normally would because you're actually cooling them with this water that's going through it. Now, temperature is normally the limiting factor, so we can get a higher RPM and more fuel and more thrust without overheating the engine. So in theory, it was a great thing. However, the drawback was that if you throw water into a combustion chamber, you're going to put out some of the fire. And that's what happened. And you had to live with that, but the result was that you had that, this stuff, the black smoke. You could always tell when that generation of jet aircraft were taking off, especially if they were using their water injection. You would always get this black smoke, and that's, as I say, as a result of having put some of the fire out in the engine, you're stuck with this unburnt fuel. So there you go. And that was something. The water injection was very good, but obviously it was not as good as it could be, and it was phased out over the course of time. During the Vietnam conflict, which is when I was flying the thing, as it says up here, we did about over 800,000 refuelings. Most of them fighters. We did a bit of refueling of the bombers coming out of Guam, but they also had bombers operating out of other places in Thailand and such that didn't need refueling to go into Vietnam and back. So primarily our job was in support of fighter operations, mostly the fighters that were operating up towards and into North Vietnam, although we had some search and rescue missions also and things of that nature. They built 820 730 as tankers, and as of last year they still had almost 400 airframes flying. So the airplane has been around a good long time, considering that it went into service in '57. So it's moving on in years. Now, obviously, it's not the same as it always was. It's been upgraded, as we'll see. The main customer that we used, serviced, was the B-52D model. This was the model that was being used during the Vietnam War, and this is the typical paint job that they had during that war. The black underside and the jungle camouflage on the top. The D model was distinct in having a tail gunner with four 20mm cannon, and he sat back here in the tail, and if he had to bail out, he just pulled a switch and the whole tail end of the airplane just fell off. The two pilots have upward ejecting seats up in the cockpit. The navigators are sitting downstairs, and they had downward ejecting seats. Now, I've got a total of 3 hours and 52 minutes in one of these things on a bombing mission over South Vietnam that I just went along as an observer. The observer doesn't have an ejection seat. What you have to do is wait until the navigators go, and then they don't even have a jump seat, really. They have a kind of a platform behind the pilots where you sit with a little sort of hollowed out section of aluminum, and you can't even wear a parachute there. So I felt that, you know, if anything really happened to this airplane, it was probably not going to be that easy for me to get out. Everybody else would go boom, and I would have to grab my parachute, put it on, climb downstairs, down the ladder, and then find a hole in the floor that the navigators went out, and then leap through it and hope that I didn't hit anything on the way out. So there you go. As I say, there was a certain level of fatalism in flying these things. So this was the primary nuclear support that we did, was operating out of Westover in support of the 52s, but we also supported them out of Guam, as I said. Now, our primary function in Vietnam, or during the Vietnam War, was operating out of Tak Ly Air Base in Thailand in support of the F-105s. We took them, as it says there, up to the North Vietnamese border, the border of Laos, topped them off with fuel, and then just hung around, waited for them to come off the strike, and took them home. A lot of people have asked me over time, the 105 was nicknamed the Thud, and there was a reason for that, but you have to be an American to understand it. There was the official name of the airplane was the Thunder Chief. Okay, Republic Aircraft, who built it, always named Thunder something. So Thunderbolt, P-47, Thunderjet, Thunder Streak. Now they had the Thunder Chief. Well, in the United States in the 50s and 60s, there was a children's TV program called Howdy Doody. And Howdy Doody had a character on it who was Chief Thunder Thud of the Tinkatonka tribe. And so, of course, pilots being what pilots are, they started calling this thing the Thunder Thud, and it just got mutated into the Thud. There was also the fact that Republic at this point in history, when it started making jet fighters, had a history. The saying was, if you built a runway around the equator, Republic would build an airplane that needed every inch of it. And so it was considered to be quite a hog at low level. And certainly on takeoff, it ate up a lot of fuel, which is why we were there. We were there to top them off as they went up. We also refueled several other types of aircraft out of Thailand. The F-4, as you can see, and the F-105, the one you see on the boom right there, is a two-seater. These were used for what they used to call the Wild Weasel missions. Their job was to go in and attract anti-aircraft fire, designate the site of the missile or anti-aircraft weapon, and then the other supporting single-seat F-105s would go in and attack the anti-aircraft sites. These Wild Weasels would go in before the main strike package in order to clear out anti-aircraft emplacements. Now, the area around Hanoi had more flak and anti-aircraft even than Berlin did in World War II. So it was a very, very, very serious issue, and we lost a lot of F-105s going into North Vietnam because of this. The F-105 was never designed to be a fighter, nor was it ever designed to be dropping iron bombs. It was designed to sit in a quick alert hangar in Germany, launch with an internally carried nuclear weapon, fly at supersonic speed right on the deck, toss a bomb at Moscow, and get the heck out. It was never designed to do the kind of job it was meant to do in Vietnam, which meant there were some compromises that had to be made, one of which was in the range of the aircraft and its actual performance, because when you hung a whole set of iron bombs under it, along with, it had a Gatling gun in it as well with all the ammunition, it was right up at its max gross weight for takeoff, and they used an awful lot of fuel getting airborne, and we had to top them off several times going up towards North Vietnam. Now you'll notice the difference here also. The refueling receptacle on the 105 you see is in front of the pilots, which was very handy because when we were taking them across the ocean, they would hook up and we could tow them while the pilot ate his little flight lunch and he didn't have to fly the airplane. So it was quite useful for that. And quite often when they were coming out of Vietnam and they were shot up, the pilot might be injured, they were leaking fuel out of every conceivable area, we'd hook them up on the boom and tow them in. One of the guys towed an F-105 right down final approach and just pickled him off at 500 feet. He was losing so much fuel, I could barely keep the engine running with all 6 pumps on the tanker, but we got him back on the ground. The F-4 Phantom, the receptacle was back here, and that required quite a bit of a different technique for as far as the fighter pilots went to get onto the boom and stay there during refueling. And although it was possible to tow an F-4, it wasn't nearly as easy because the airplane wanted to keep pitching down. Now the bottom is another aircraft that operated out of Tak Lee. This is the B-66. Now the B-66 was originally designed as a medium nuclear bomber once again, but during the Vietnam War it was used as an electronics countermeasures aircraft. They ripped out the bomb bay, put a lot of electronic equipment in there, and a couple of electronic warfare operators, and they would go in to jam all of the North Vietnamese radar, again, with the Wild Weasels in advance of the main strike package. So it was important that we could refuel them. But you'll notice that he is actually on a drogue, which is kind of the sort of default position for everybody in the world except the U.S. Air Force. Now, the KC-135, unfortunately, you had to make a choice. Either put the drogue on or leave the drogue off. You couldn't do anything about it once it was there. So if we had the drogue on, That meant we were limited to refueling aircraft that had the probe. We couldn't refuel F-4s or 105s if they did not have a probe built into the aircraft. Some of the F-4s did later on. The F-105s eventually were modified with a probe that would come out. But basically we were stuck like this. Now, since this is the Fleet Air Museum, we did use that drogue to refuel U.S. Navy aircraft, because quite often what they had come up with was this single tanker philosophy. In other words, the U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command was supplying tankers for all of the American aircraft being used in the Southeast Asia War. So that relieved the Navy of having to have their own tankers. Now they had a version of the B-66 that they were using as a tanker that was capable of flying off of a carrier, but we could just fly around in an orbit all day and refuel any Navy fighters that came up, so that's what we did. So that single source of refueling was quite intricate, and it was part of our mission. Some days we were refueling these guys, and then some days we'd go out over the Gulf of Hainan and service the aircraft that were coming off of the carriers. The other operation that we did during the Southeast Asian conflict was refueling the SR-71s. They were based at Kadena, Okinawa, and it's called the habu. The habu is a venomous snake that is native to Okinawa, and most of the SR-71s that were based there had a little coiled snake on the tail, and so they were known, that was their call sign, actually, Habu 61 or whatever it might be. And so we had to refuel them. Now the problem is they're using JP7. The tanker used JP4 as fuel. JP4 is very similar to Jet A1, which is what normal airliners would fly. So we couldn't actually burn the fuel that had to go into the SR-71. So there was a very complex system of fuel tanks, pumps, and this, that, and the other thing that kept the fuel segregated so that we didn't get his fuel and he didn't get our fuel. And so this was another mission. Now I never flew the Q model, and that's all that Q stood for, was that's the one that refuels these guys, because it had the plumbing in it. I didn't fly those. They were based at March Air Force Base in California, and came over and did tours at Okinawa supporting the SR-71 operations. And that was the patch that they had. Only if they had flown operational missions. You could not get the patch if you just were flying training missions. You had to have gone out and flown over China or North Vietnam or something of that nature in your SR-71 in order to get the Habu patch. Our main operating base in Thailand, as far as the headquarters of the tanker operation, was at Utapao Air Base in Satahip, which is just down the road from Pattaya Beach, if you've ever been there on vacation. So it was the primary base. We did not refuel bombers out of there. It was the logistics and administrative center of the tanker operations, but we flew our missions primarily out of, as I say, Takli for the F-105s, Korat for the F-4s, and a couple of other places in Southeast Asia for other missions, which we will talk about here in a second. And it was when I was at Utapao that I managed to snag an observer ride with a guy who was my next door neighbor back at Westover. He took me up on a 3-hour and 52-minute bombing mission over South Vietnam, which convinced me firmly that I never wanted to fly the B-52. I was quite happy with my little tanker, because once we passed our gas, it was back to the bar. So we take off, we go out, we empty our fuel tanks into the receiver, and then head back to the officers' club. So it was a gentleman's sort of life. Rather than going out and dropping bombs on people for 12 hours, we were back on the ground within 2 hours. So we kind of like that. This is a map of the refueling areas that we used. And you can see here, here's Utapao down here near Satahip, near Pattaya Beach. That was our main base. Takli is where the F-105s were based, and Korat which was where the F-4s were based. Now, there were also F-4s coming out of Ubon, but we didn't have tankers based there. We would refuel F-4s out of Ubon, but we didn't have any tankers in place at that base. There were also aircraft coming out of Udorn and Nakhon Phanom, but they did not need tankers just to go into North Vietnam. But we would take our F-105s up to these, they were called anchors, these refueling orbits up here. And we were using the fruit ones. We had orange anchor, lemon, peach, and something else, cherry. I can't read it from this particular distance. Those are the ones that we used. And we would take the aircraft up there, refuel them. They'd go in to the North Vietnam targets and come back, and then we would bring them back to Tak Ly. Now, the other mission that we had that didn't involve refueling was called, the call sign was Luzon. It was a radio relay mission. We had an airplane that was filled with a bunch of people in the back with great big radios, and what we did, we sat out here in this long orbit here in the Gulf of Tonkin, in between Hainan Island and Haiphong Harbor, and we would orbit there for 8 hours, relaying all of the distress calls from the downed fighter pilots and people who had been shot down in pretty much all of Vietnam, but primarily North Vietnam. So they would have their little emergency radio in their survival vest. They would broadcast, and of course that's a very short range line of sight UHF transmitter. We'd pick it up and then we'd broadcast it out at 1,000,000 watts or something over all of Southeast Asia, so that the rescue individuals, the Jolly Green helicopters, the Sandys, the Spads, all of the different search and rescue people would be able to hear the downed airmen talking. This is sort of a shot at all the different things that were going on. Red Crown, which was a boat in the Gulf of Tonkin, he was the general coordinator for all search and rescue. So Red Crown ran all of the saving of pilots that was going on in the North Vietnam area. This was us, radio relay in the Gulf of Tonkin, which was, as I say, call sign Luzon. But they also had, this was the EA-3B, which is the Navy equivalent of the B-66. They were electronic countermeasures. We also had EC-121s, which is the military version of a Lockheed Constellation, the old triple-tailed four-engine airliner. That was used up until the invention, or the 135 with the big radome on top came into play, but that was much later. Then we had the RC-135. These were the reconnaissance, the electronic reconnaissance versions. The 135C, the 135M, they were all very secret stuff. They never tell us what was going on, but they were receiver capable. In other words, normal KC-135s could not take on fuel. We could only pass it back. But the reconnaissance versions had a refueling receptacle, so they could take on fuel. Obviously, the U-2s, they were operating out of Benoit Air Base in Vietnam and also out of Okinawa. And I did mention the SR-71s, but you don't see them there because they were too secret at the time to be shown on these sort of things. The airplane that we flew for the radio relay missions was slightly different. You can see along the top, a lot of, these are UHF radio antennas, and this is where we were picking up all of the distress signals. We had banks of equipment in the back with radio operators, people who could speak Vietnamese, people who could relay the information. So we did quite a bit of this sort of stuff. As I said, we flew this out of Kadena, so it was basically a 12-hour mission. You'd fly down to the Gulf of Tonkin, orbit for 8 hours, and then fly back. So it was somewhat tiring. We had a very rudimentary autopilot on the airplane. It could you could turn it with the autopilot, you could fly straight and level, but there was no programming anything in. You had to actually follow that orbit yourself and make corrections for wind drift. It was all very old school Stone Age stuff. But now we get to the real job, which was refueling things. The boom operator, or boomer as we used to call him, was down in the back here in this pod, the boom pod, and he had a window that flipped up so that he could see out. This is a B-52 with a number of iron bombs slung under it, and that was the primary way that the bombers got refueled, was through the, as I say, through the flying boom. And the whole flying boom concept, which is only used by the U.S. Air Force and I think the French and maybe the Israelis, it was designed for heavy aircraft because the heavy aircraft can't maneuver as well as a fighter can. So finding a drogue with a B-52 would be very difficult. The thing handles like a London bus. As I said, my entire 3 hours and 52 minutes, but I did get to fly. So the autopilot on the B-52 has what's called an air refueling mode, which gives a little bit more ability for it to make small corrections. Otherwise, it just sort of sits back there and wallows. The boomer was in the center. He had a stick. You can just see the handle of it down here. And he would fly the boom with the stick, and he could extend the boom and retract it. It had about a 15-foot extension. And so the bomber would come in and try to stay positioned, or the fighter for that matter, and he would just fly the boom down and then punch it in, and it would make contact. We'd pass the fuel. And also, the other reason that we use the flying boom for the bombers is because it gave you a much higher fuel flow rate than the little hose they had with the drogue. So we were passing a lot of fuel to the bombers. We'd sometimes give them close to 100,000 pounds of fuel, and that had to happen fairly quickly. And with all 6 pumps on, we were doing 6,000 pounds a minute, which still takes quite a while to get through 100,000 pounds of fuel, but it was possible. And we could offload everything down to standpipe fuel in our tanks, which was 20,000 pounds of fuel, and that would kind of get you halfway home, which is why I said you wanted to be fatalistic. So he had some instruments, and he had 2 pallets over here for observers or people who were students, etc., instructors, and all that. This is how we guided the bombers or the fighters in who were using the flying boom. As you can see, there's a yellow line down the center of the fuselage, so he can use that to line up horizontally. But then we have a series of pilot indicator lights here, aft and forward, so coming that way, and then down and up. So the pilot would sit back there and follow those lights until he got to the center position, which you can just barely make out. But this is a square here, and there's the same thing here. So by positioning the aircraft using those lights, he could be roughly in the position where the boom operator could fire off the boom into the aircraft. Cargo deck was pretty much wide open all the time. We did a lot of cargo flying to and from Southeast Asia when we weren't refueling. We'd put all of the hibachi pots and furniture that people had bought overseas and pile it in the center and then come home with it. That was part of the job. The cockpit layout, when I was flying it was very old school. No real electronic instruments, and quite a big, it's hard to see, but it's quite a big fuel panel. This is the current configuration of the ones, some of the ones that are flying. There's actually a newer configuration than this. They have electronic now displays here, flat panel displays for the attitude indicator and the navigation. They have flight management systems, same as airliners do, using GPS and INS navigation, which we never had. All we had was Celestial, and a couple of other things that never worked. And a much smaller fueling panel because they don't have to do quite as much singing and dancing as they used to. And now they don't use a navigator. We always flew with a navigator. Ta-da! That is the periscopic sextant. I have gone back and forth across the Pacific I don't know how many times. relying on celestial navigation, which is absolutely wonderful, the same way Magellan did it, or Francis Drake or somebody. The only problem, of course, with celestial is you're never much more than 100 miles off course. You know? Nowadays, they yell at you if you get 10 feet left of center line. We were lucky if we hit the west coast of the United States. And when we were going the other way, we would have the radios on, the weather radar cocked down, trying to find Hawaii or Guam, or Wake Island especially, because Wake is very small. We would have everything in the world on, and so quite often, especially over the Pacific, we'd be stuck in a cloud layer for hours without the ability to get a star shot. And so it was, all we were relying on was the fact that the navigator had gotten a good fix at some point, and we just held the heading and hoped for the best. We always got where we were going, sooner or later. The sextant, that periscopic bit, fit up through this hole in the ceiling. There was a plate that came across. And our enterprising boom operators learned very soon that if you made a modification to a vacuum cleaner hose, you could stick it up there and vacuum out the cockpit. Before we came back to land, we do that. They stopped us doing that, though, because some of the dirt and debris that they were sucking up off the floor went up out of the roof and back directly into the tube in the vertical stabilizer that gave us our control field. So that, and they used to fire hard-boiled eggs out of it just for the hell of it. A 12-hour mission can get very boring when all you're doing is drawing circles in the sky. This was the navigator station. At the time, we had two other methods of navigation. One was Doppler radar, which was next to useless over water, and the other was LORAN, which our navigators didn't like because the chart was too big for his table. So we tended to rely on, when we were over land, we were relying on VOR, TACAN, the ground-based navigational aids, and when we were over the ocean, 99% of the time it was all celestial, and just doing the same thing the Japanese did going to Pearl Harbor, turning on the Hawaiian broadcast station and saying, oh, there's Hawaii, let's go that way. So, as I say, pretty old school. All different now. This is gone. The new ones do not have a navigator station. Navigators are still used occasionally for special missions in areas where no one wants to advertise their presence. But basically, we're using the same navigational equipment now that airliners do. So we're capable of adhering to all of the current navigational requirements for distance off course and stuff without getting too technical. Here's a film that takes a few minutes, so we'll have a look at
precious time. So we were able to send B-52s non-stop and quickly to Guam made in Vietnam operate out of Guam. It's a long haul from Guam to Vietnam and back, and there's no way to complete the mission without air refueling.
So what you saw with all the bombers and tankers was what we used to call a COCO exercise. It was an effort to get all of the bombers and tankers that were on the Quick Alert Force airborne within a certain time period, and we were taking off at theoretically 1 minute intervals, which meant that if you were at the back of the line, you ended up with a lot of wake turbulence, a lot of difficulty in getting airborne, which is another reason that we really didn't like doing that sort of thing. Now, what are the new developments? Well, this is good. They now have the CFM56. This aircraft is actually based here in the UK at Mildenhall. Square D, that's the 100th bomb group left over from World War II. And I was on this one at the Royal International Air Tattoo last year, not this year. They now have 22,000 pounds of thrust per engine. Now, if the old ones had 10,000 pounds of thrust, plus a little bit on water, this is giving you an awful lot of extra power. It can carry 50% more fuel to offload. It has 25% better range, and it has 25% better performance. The takeoff roll is reduced by 3,500 feet, and I was assured, and although this is apocryphal, by the aircraft commander of this aircraft when I spoke to him at RIA, that empty, with just the airplane as it is here, with no fuel on for other aircraft, can outclimb an F-15 to 15,000 feet, which I think is pretty good for a great big old girl like that. And bearing in mind that these airframes are close to 50 years old. This is an old airplane. Now the wings have been reskinned, spars have been rebuilt, so it's like, I think someone said earlier, it's like the headsman's axe. It's had 5 new handles and 3 new heads, but it's still a headsman's axe. So this thing, the airframe is basically the same, but it's got a lot of new stuff in it. So they've retrofitted it with navigational equipment, they've retrofitted it with new engines. It's still in use, it's still a very, very capable tanker. Don't know when they're going to get rid of them. As I said earlier, they have about 390 of the things still flying, which is amazing considering there were 700 and some tankers commissioned back in the 50s. So you got over half of them still airborne. Of course, they've cut back on the B-52s. We used to have about 800 B-52s, and now I think there are 70 left flying, but they've just decided they're going to keep that going for another 50 years. So you're going to have some 100-year-old airframes out there eventually on the B-52. They just keep changing stuff in it to keep it going. One of the later mods that we have now are the multi-point pods, built so that we have them on the wingtips. Now we can use both the boom and the drogues because we have a NATO capability now that enables us to refuel things that we normally couldn't without swapping out that drogue, etc. So that has increased the utility of the aircraft quite a bit. Still have a boom operator, but as I said, the navigator is no longer carried on normal missions. Now, this is the latest. Actually, there's one more upgrade after this, but the Block 45 upgrade is now the latest one that is actually being used. And that is giving them a full glass cockpit. All of the old engine instruments and nav instruments have been replaced. It's got a state-of-the-art flight management computers for the pilots, and it has the same abilities with GPS navigation, etc., that all of the most modern airliners do. So they keep improving the old girl, and she's still out there passing gas, as we used to say. So that's basically it. I'm open for questions if you have any, or rotten eggs, or tomatoes, or whatever you might have to toss up there.